On the whole, the Yamaha Montage M represents a major step forward from the original Montage, both in terms of capabilities and workflow, but there are a handful of changes that are far from improvements, and some of them are clear steps backwards. Some of these issues are little more than my opinion as a seasoned user of the classic Montage, while others represent serious regressions that should be addressed urgently. Let's take a look at some of them. I'm going to start with something that Yamaha could easily fix, that being the choice of colours for the Montage M display. While the original Montage and the Modi X have an interface with varying shades of grey in the background and brightly coloured buttons, Montage M opts for a much darker design, which is fine in principle, but there are some design decisions that are distinctly suboptimal, and they're obvious even on the main performance home screen. Firstly, we have the VU meters that show the audio output level for each part. On the original Montage, the meters have a black background into which a coloured bar rises with clear distinctions in colour between the green, yellow and red parts of the meter. Montage M shows a coloured gradient background into which a more brightly coloured bar rises. The red, yellow and green parts of this bar are not clearly delineated, opting instead to use another gradient. As a colourblind person, I can say without a moment of hesitation that this is the worst change made to Montage M, as while the VU meters on the classic Montage were easy for me to read, on Montage M they are virtually invisible, and it's a real struggle for me to see the audio output levels at all, either on Performance Home or the mixer interface. A similar problem affects some of the on-off gadgets on screen. If we look at Solo, for example, the difference between Solo off and Solo on is very subtle, and it's made even worse when the control gains a white box around it to indicate the current focus. Not all controls share the same problem. Mute, for example, has a very obvious distinction between its on and off states, but I've been caught out several times by parts being soloed without me noticing. Another example is the Auto Select toggle on the controller sign screen. When you click on the control, it gets a white focus box around it, and then it's anyone's guess as to whether you've just switched it on or off. Thankfully, these are not unfixable issues. I'd love to see Yamaha provide a firmware update including an option to use the classic Montage colour scheme on Montage M, or just some tweaks to make the interface more visually accessible. I've posted an idea scale suggestion that I've linked in the description, and I'd love to see it get some more votes so that Yamaha is made aware of just what a problem this really is. Back on the subject of controller sign, and I'm struggling to understand why Yamaha has chosen to implement control assignments for polyphonic aftertouch in the way that they have. If you set the aftertouch mode to channel, as would be the case on the classic Montage or the Montage M6 and M7, you can assign a parameter to be controlled by aftertouch by focusing the parameter, arming controller sign, and pressing a key down into the aftertouch zone. However, if the aftertouch mode is set to polyphonic, the same workflow doesn't work at all, and in fact you have to manually set up the control assignment rather than using the control assign button. Furthermore, control assignments for polyphonic aftertouch appear in a different interface from the assignments for all other controllers, which is a really confusing design decision. So I'd like to see control assign for poly aftertouch work in the same way as it does for channel aftertouch, and to see all control assignments, including those for poly aftertouch, in the same control assign interface as everything else. My next gripe could easily be considered to be a matter of taste, but I think that the way the original Montage behaves in this regard is better than Montage M. In the category search system, you can have a category and subcategory selected to filter the list of performances. But if you click on the text search facility and enter a value, the category and subcategory filters are cleared, although you can reselect them after your text search if you wish. Using Montage M, the filters are not cleared automatically, leaving you with a search that includes both text, category and subcategory. I think that the original method is better, because if you're searching by text, you're far more likely to be searching for a specific performance rather than narrowing an existing filter. For example, if I have a pad loaded on Montage M, when I open category search, the pad category is automatically selected, and when I use text search to look for CFX, I get no results. With classic Montage, the same search would take me straight to CFX results, and as I said, this is very much a matter of preference, but I prefer that. This is going to be a controversial one, but I'm not 100% sure that the changes to the MIDI implementation for Montage M are entirely for the better. With the classic Montage, you have 3 completely different MIDI modes. The default mode is multi, where each part is assigned its own MIDI channel according to its part number. So part 1 receives and transmits MIDI channel 1, part 2 uses channel 2, and part 16 uses channel 16. These channel allocations cannot be altered. However, this makes playing some performances where a single instrument spans multiple parts, such as the Concert CFX, a bit of a nightmare. So Yamaha also included a mode called Single, where every part will respond to signals on a single channel of your choice. But while Single mode solves the problem of playing single instruments that span multiple parts, it removes the ability to separately play other parts of the performance. With Montage OS 3, Yamaha introduced Hybrid MIDI mode, where all parts that have keyboard control enabled will send and receive MIDI on a single channel of your choice, while all other parts will continue to send and receive on separate channels according to their part number. For Montage M, the ability to choose the MIDI mode has been removed, and the implementation is based on the Hybrid mode from Montage OS 3, except that it's now possible to specify the MIDI channel to be used for each part separately from its part number, including the ability to have multiple parts respond to the same MIDI channel. But Hybrid mode has a problem, and that problem was actually recognised with Montage OS 3, and the interface alerts you to the presence of the problem. Imagine you have a 5-part performance. On the original Montage, these 5 parts will be controlled by MIDI channels 1 to 5, unless any of them have keyboard control enabled, in which case those parts will be controlled by the MIDI channel you specify in the MIDI I/O channel setting. This system falls over if you set the MIDI I/O channel to a number which corresponds to a part that does not have keyboard control enabled, because at this point there will be no way to control that part with MIDI. Or switch to the multi-MIDI mode for full hands-on control. Montage M does not show the warning, and with the ability to change MIDI mode removed, your only option is to either change the MIDI channel in use for the affected part, or to change the MIDI I/O channel. There is a workaround which effectively gives Montage M the ability to work in multi-MIDI mode, but it's not particularly friendly. You need to disable keyboard control for every part, and then each part will respond to its own separate MIDI channel, as it would on the classic Montage, but of course now the parts won't respond to the built-in keyboard at all. You may or may not consider that to be a problem. Another MIDI-related thing I want to highlight is the loss of a setting I commonly use. On the original Montage, there's a setting under MIDI I/O called ARP MIDI Out, which only works when the Montage is in multi-MIDI mode. It's commonly used as part of the ARP Rec On DAW quick setup macro, and it controls whether Montage transmits the notes being generated by the arpeggiator or just the notes being actually played on the keyboard. I consider this a loss because with ARP MIDI Out enabled, it's possible to apply Montage arpeggios to virtual instruments or other hardware synths, which is a really great function. Once again, there's a suggestion on Ideascale that could use your votes to get Yamaha to bring the feature back to Montage M. The next item on the list relates to the assignable knobs. The classic Montage shows the name and value of each assignable knob on the primary display, which I always find useful. Montage M moves this information to the secondary display, which is fine of course, although I still find myself glancing at the main display and being surprised not to find the info I'm looking for there. However, there is one function that is no longer present, and that is the way that each assignable knob changes its display if its value is being controlled by a motion sequence. Classic Montage shows the knob surrounded by a coloured gradient to indicate motion sequence control, but Montage M does not display this information at all, leaving you to guess the reason why the knobs are moving on their own. Back on the performance home screen, Montage M has a lot more flexibility when it comes to the controls available, and the display mode control under the display allows you to switch between various different part level controls, which is a welcome addition. But I happen to think that the selection of controls available on the original Montage was a really good choice, and I do wish that one of the display mode options available on Montage M would replicate the original selection, showing on-off controls for ARP and motion sequence and the keyboard range for each part. These are now shown in separate display modes on Montage M, which just slows me down somewhat due to the memory of how things used to be laid out. In the editor, another notable omission on Montage M is the All Elements page, where commonly edited parameters for all 8 elements are displayed on the same screen. This can be useful for getting an overview of expanded articulation groupings and for setting things like detuning and level. It is completely missing from Montage M. Everything I've mentioned so far has been a software issue, which Yamaha could address in an operating system update, and I think if they did so, it would make for welcome improvements to Montage M. For the most part, the changes to the physical interface on Montage M are very positive, but I do find myself wishing that the extensive button grid from the classic Montage hadn't been removed. The 8x4 button grid on the original Montage can be somewhat daunting at first glance with its huge 32 button array, but once you understand how it all works, it can provide a serious productivity boost. Montage M has replaced the button grid with a more focused 4x4 grid, which controls either category selection or live set slots. The new system is great in that in live set mode, you can see what performance from the current live set page is currently in use even when you drop to Performance Home, and likewise in category selection mode, the current category remains indicated. This is new functionality for Montage M and is not available for the classic Montage. However, the new functions come at a cost. In Door Remote, the button grid presented dedicated hardware buttons to control track selection, mute, solo and record arm for each of the 8 currently controlled tracks. While these functions are still available through hardware on Montage M, accessing them requires slightly convoluted shift-click combinations rather than having dedicated single-purpose buttons. Using the old-style button grid in part control mode, you have one-touch access to select any of the 16 parts and to toggle motion sequence and arpeggio status for the first 8 parts. Using Montage M, the first 8 parts can be directly selected using the 8 part buttons under the faders, and parts 9 to 16 can be selected after shift-clicking the 1 to 8, 9 to 16 button. But physical controls to toggle motion sequence and arpeggio status for each part no longer exist, unless you directly select a part, change the display mode to ARP MS Porter, and use the knobs under the display to switch the status of the currently selected part. In performance control mode, the button grid on the classic Montage has dedicated buttons to select one of the first 8 parts and to toggle their mute status. The 3rd and 4th rows of the grid allow the user to directly select the active motion sequence and arpeggio numbers from 1 to 8. Montage M allows parts to be muted using the part buttons after shift-clicking part control, but there's no way to jump directly to a particular motion sequence or arpeggio number using the hardware. You now have to use the encoders under the screen to scroll through the numbers to get to the one you want. In the sound editor, the classic Montage provides dedicated buttons on the grid to select parts, select elements or operators within those parts, and to mute those elements or operators. Montage M moves these functions to the part buttons too, with Shift Part allowing element or operator selection, and Mute available with Shift Part after shift-clicking the keyboard control mode. While this isn't quite such a loss as the inability to click a button for a particular motion sequence or arpeggio number, the complex shift-clicking process and the inability to have part selection, element selection, and element mute all available at the same time is taking me some time to get used to. Unfortunately, the full 8x4 button grid no longer exists on Montage M, so this is not something that'll be able to be addressed with firmware, and it's just something we have to live with. But there are a couple of interface tweaks that could make things better. While the classic Montage shows clickable buttons on screen for each element or operator, Montage M moves these to a drop-down menu, which requires an extra click to select the element or operator you want. While I can understand the logic here, in that AWM2 parts can now have 128 elements, and these couldn't possibly all be given a dedicated button on the panel or the display, most parts stick to the old limit of 8 elements, and it would have been good to have more direct access to these on the display. That brings my list to an end, and I just want to clarify once again that on balance, Montage M represents a major improvement over the classic Montage in almost every aspect, but as a user of the classic Montage or Modi X, it's worth being aware of these changes so they don't take you by surprise. If you have any other examples of things that have changed with Montage M that you don't feel are for the better, please let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.